I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is The Color Between the Lines. In this edition of The Color Between the Lines, we're talking with New York Times best-selling author Tiffany Jewell, and the book is called Everything I Learned About Racism in School. I want to welcome you back to the BIN.
Thanks for having me. I love being here. So any opportunity to chat with you, please.
I loved your last book, and I was like, oh, she's got another one. This is awesome. I mean, your past two books, the book is Racist and The Anti-Racist Kid, right?
This book is anti-racist. Yeah.
This book is Anti-Racist and The Anti-Racist Kid. They reflected a lot about teaching and what you've done with students and the whole process of trying to get students to connect with some of their experiences and such. However, this approach to this book is very different because it doesn't reflect other kids, but really your own personal work as self, recognizing racist behavior in school and how you dealt with it. Why did you decide to take this approach?
There were a couple of things. Like the first was I was doing a keynote during the pandemic, at the very beginning of the pandemic, an online keynote to a bunch of educators, and it was just like sharing my schooling story. And there was a moment where I was like, oh, and pretty much everything I learned about racism I learned in school. And we were all like, whoa, and like reflecting like that's absolutely true. And I had been telling my schooling story, but I hadn't like put it all together. Um, and so I always like look at kind of like my role as an author now is the same as an educator, but I just get to like reach more people. So I get to tell these stories, but not just my stories. Like there's a whole bunch of other people in the book too. And it was really different. And I also like think of like all the kids who read my first book, this book is anti-racist. Like they're like, now I know what racism is and I know like I can do stuff about it. But like let's look at this institution that like we've had to go to, we've been a part of for most of our lives. Um, hoping that they'll like grow with the book too.
It seems like when you talked about that epiphany moment, you're like, oh, there it is. There it is. Were there a lot of moments when you were writing this book? Because I know you have other people's narratives, but for your own personal self, were there other moments where you had other epiphany moments where like, oh, I didn't realize this?
Yeah, like everything. I did a ton of research for the book. And so a lot of it was kind of researching my own city, like Syracuse, New York, and my own schools, and looking at the history of schools in that, even being like my elementary school had a hyphenated name. And I was like, why is it named this? And so doing the research on like why, the schools when they merged together, and figuring out who my high school was named after, because we just like I didn't know who he was. So those moments, but then also there was like this huge realization because I started school in 1984. It was preschool. I went to preschool for 2 years, and then I graduated college in 2003. And so I thought like, oh, it was like the post, integration experiment. Like we figured it out by the 80s, but we didn't. Like my magnet school that I went to was pretty new. I think it was, it started in the late 70s. Like the neighborhood school became a magnet school, which was like the city's like solution to into integrating schools, because volunteer busing didn't work, shutting schools down didn't work, like all of these things. And I was like, wait a minute, we were the experiment. Like I did not know that. And so that was like one of those moments where I was like, oh my goodness, like what if students knew, what if we had known then that we were a part of the experiment? Like I would have like understood things so much more differently, I think, and not have had to like go back and do this like deep reflection on integration in the Northeast, in particular.
I mean, I think in a way maybe, but when you're a kid and you're going through everything else, it's a different process. And then when you get a reflection, it's another process of
Right.
understanding where you were and why you were and what you did and why you did it. And I think that that probably was some of the things that you were going through with the reflection. I'm wondering, when
Mhm.
you used other people's narratives throughout, was that on purpose or was that by accident? What, how did that
Mhm.
happen?
It was definitely on purpose. As I was writing the book, I was like, my goal is always to have like anyone who picks up the book to see themselves in the book. And I realized like my story, while like relatable in parts for some people, is not relatable to some kids at all. And so I started thinking about other authors and educators and people whose stories who've told me stories. And I was like, wow, I would just want like people to know their stories. And so I asked like a lot of folks and all folks of the global majority, and like everyone said yes and shared their stories, and
Awesome.
they're incredible, and they really just like bring a wholeness to our understanding of racism in school that like my story could not have done alone.
Mm. Were there any accounts that really surprised you from other people
Hmm.
or that maybe you connected more with than others?
Yeah, they're like I loved them all, which is like it's so nice. Like when they came in, I was just like, I can't believe like people are sending me these amazing stories. Lorena Herman's story. I love Lorena. And we've been friends, but I did not know a lot about her schooling background, what it was like for her as a Dominican American kid growing up in central Massachusetts. And so like her story, like while her story is like very unique to her, it's not. Like there are moments where I'm like, that's just like this moment that happened to me or it happened to somebody else. And then Min Lay's story in it, it's an elementary school. He was like one of two Asian boys in his class, and it was like one of those projects where you had to like do a self-portrait, and the teacher was handing out mirrors and ran out, and the kids like Min and his friend just looked at each other, and they were like, oh, we'll draw each other, but like Min's Vietnamese, his friend was not, like, and nobody like realized that too, and like how nice it is to see yourself reflected in another kid, and also you shouldn't have to do that. You should be able to draw yourself and see yourself fully for who you are. And that was
Wow.
one of those stories I was like, man, so many kids are going to be like, I know that that happened to me, or that reminds me of this time that this happened, or
The part where the person wrote, "What are you?" And they kept
mm-hmm,
saying that, "What are you?"
mm-hmm.
That
Randy
I
Reeves
totally
story.
understood that. What are you? That
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
And getting that from different various groups, from Black folks, from white folks,
Mm-hmm.
from Latin folks, everybody asking, "What are you?" You
Oh
know,
my
so
gosh. Yeah.
kind of interesting that was in there that those
Yeah. And you're like,
that
no one should ever ask anybody that. When he sent me that story, I was like, oh, good, I don't have to write that part now. Because that's so much a part of who I am. Like I just remember being in my early 20s and going to a friend's house, and he was like, "Oh, my dad loves doing this. He plays this game where he guesses what people's races are." And I'm like, "What?" And then his dad got it completely wrong too. And I was like, "What? This is not a game." Like, wow.
yeah.
They were white. Like
Yeah.
only white people do this, but
No, I think that
oh, this
honestly, people did and
mm,
different cultures do that. And that's one of the things that I liked about your book. It was so
mhm,
varied. It wasn't just a Black point of view, it wasn't a
right.
white point of view. It was every ethnicity that you could possibly think of
Hmm.
and mixtures and such to give
Yeah.
different points of view. Did you have a certain selection process on picking people to go into the book, or how'd that go?
No. I mean, I probably should have. I just asked people, for some folks like James Bird, like I had just finished reading his book, The Brave, and I was like, I I I'm gonna ask him, I need to have his voice in this book. And other folks like Lorena and her husband Roberta, like I'd known for years. And we just talk about things so much that I'm like, I like everybody should hear your stories and your poems. And so it was just like, I didn't have a selection process. It was more like I think my editor probably would have liked if I had and maybe like had less people because it is a beast. And there are also like some contributions that like didn't even make it into the book because of editing and
Base.
publishing is a whole thing. So
Yeah, yeah. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Esther Dillard with the Black Information Network, and we're speaking with best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author, Tiffany Jewell, and the book is called Everything I Learned About Racism in School. There's a small chapter that I thought was really telling in terms of the institutionalizing of the idea of institutionalizing racism, and that was on tracking.
Mm.
And I felt like it really supported your argument about structural racism, integrating it into scholastic systems. Was this something you discovered recently? Was this something that you learned over time? How did you come to this conclusion?
Tracking was one of those things that was really obvious right from the get-go when I entered into middle school. Just the way the school was set up, like as I like share in the book, like I was in team one and we had like the sunny hallway and we got to go on all these field trips. And it was also like a culture shock because my elementary school was predominantly black and brown, but the team one was like predominantly white. And I was like, who are these kids? Where are all the kids from that, like my old classrooms? Um, and just knowing like we got to like read Romeo and Juliet and like do all these things that other kids didn't felt really like this isn't right. And I learned probably in high school, like a little bit about tracking. And then as I became a teacher and started learning more, I was like, wow, this is a system that is incredibly inequitable. And how did they even decide who, like,
Right.
no, nobody will tell me.
Yeah.
But
Do
and they
you
don't
think
even know.
that
Like,
tracking system still is integrated within the school system and it needs to be eradicated or changed? What are your assessments?
so tracking is like technically illegal. They're not allowed to do that. But then there's different things like ability grouping. And it just has different names and it definitely happens, especially when we move into middle school and like kids who need like extra support with reading, like they might miss out on the specialist classes and the ones that they actually would do really great in. Um and then, some kids as from middle schools, they're like looking at high schools. Some are like, hey, the vocational school would be perfect for you. Well, like, can everybody just try this out too? Because I think, like everybody should learn how to change a tire of a car and like how
Right.
to do their hair and stuff. So definitely like it's still, they just don't call it tracking, but it's still there.
Um,
Mhm.
you appear to make the argument that racism isn't something that kids learn usually at home, but they kind of cultivate it. They may learn some things at home, but they cultivate it in
Mhm.
institutions of learning. And this is really sad to me. So how can we as parents or educators, if you are a parent and educator, how do you change this?
Mm. For me, as an educator and a mama, it's so much of listening to young folks. And at home we have the opportunity of like listening to one or two, like listening to your kids, and it's not overwhelming, and you
Mhm.
have like this grace with each other. In schools, like there's no time, and there's like classrooms are um overcrowded in places, and so like for adults, I hope like we can, as caregivers and teachers, like use our power as adults to like really advocate for our children to have more time to explore who they are. And for as adults, for us to know more about who we are. Um, because then like we can, it's just easier. Like everything works out easier when you like have confidence in who you are. Um, instead of like questioning like your place and if you have value in your society, because everybody does, but we're not always viewed that way.
Now, for those who may not have seen your last interview and don't know a lot about you, could you maybe kind of explain to them what is some of your background and why you're drawn
Mm.
to this kind of work?
Mm. I am an educator. I've been teaching for like 2 decades at this point, mostly elementary kids, but different ages, and been working in private and public schools. So I've had a lot of different teaching experiences and in different communities. Um, and so kind of like everything has been through the lens of education, which is why this book was like something I really wanted to write. And then just as a person, like a very curious person who navigates the world as light and with like privilege in some places and others like not so much. It's been a very like interesting experience. Um, and one that like isn't like, I'm not like my experience is the one that everybody needs to know, but I have the power and access to share it and like help everyone around me like grow and to be able to share their stories too.
I think also this narrative is really an encouragement to me to other people who may want to write their own story, because the way things are written,
Hmm.
everybody has their own, all the people that contributed, they gave their own story and it had a different flavor to each person's story. And I wonder, if you were to encourage or somebody, what is your, I guess, your best advice for those who are trying to write? They're just starting, they're trying to write their own story, but they're not sure how to do that or how to get started or how to start there. What would be your advice as a writer?
Just always have like a notebook and pen or some like or your notes app on your phone um ready. Like I think ideas come to us, and to also just like not censor yourself, to just dive into it. I think a lot of times we want our writing to be perfect from the beginning, or we want our story to be perfect, but like there's this process called editing, which is amazing. And so you can write something that's like totally trash and turn it into something beautiful, if you give yourself like patience and grace and time. So allow yourself that because we deserve it.
Yeah, allow yourself the messiness, because the messiness,
Mm-hmm.
the good part, that's what makes it better.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
What's your final message, I guess, for this book?
Um, my final message, I think really with this book, I want every reader to see themselves in this book somewhere and to know that like you're not alone. Um, that together, like we have this story and of schooling that's not always great and that we can make it better. Like we have the power. I'm an optimist, so we have the power to make it better if we can just like dream beyond the box that we're in.
I love that message. Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much for
You're
joining us on the
welcome.
BIN.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Well, that's it for this edition of The Color Between the Lines. I'm Esther Dillard, and the book is called Everything I Learned About Racism in School by Tiffany Jewell. Pick it up.